The first thing that tipped the world on its side wasn't a confession or a fight. It was the scent of Tessa's perfume on my husband's jacket, a soft citrus lilac that lingers like a promise you can't quite prove. I caught it as I set his suit on the back of a chair, the same clean note I'd hugged 100 times on Tessa at school fundraisers and neighborhood cookouts. The jacket pocket held a folded place card from the Whitmore Grand Tessa's handwriting, looping across Mark's name, as if it belonged there. A faint smear of coral gloss kissed the inside lapel, where a collar should have covered it small enough to doubt bright enough to brand the moment into memory. Somewhere in the apartment, the dishwasher hummed, and Lily's bedroom door cracked open to the murmur of a teen show, ordinary sounds that made the perfume feel louder. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if stories of quiet justice help you sleep a little easier. Tap like and subscribe. There's more to this than perfume, and you'll want to hear how it ends. My name is Elena Brooks, and when people ask what I do, I tell them I spend my days helping other people's kids figure out their next step. I've been a high school counselor for over 20 years, the kind of woman who color codes calendars and remembers who needs extra time on tests and who needs an extra smile on Mondays. I married young and steady to a man who promised the same, a salesman who rose into a regional title and learned to live in airports without complaint. We made a home in a quiet suburb where the maples turn a fierce red in October, and the mail still lands in metal boxes on wooden posts. It was the sort of life you can set your watch by meals at the table, jokes about the dog. We never got Saturday errands, and Lily rolling her eyes at both of us like clockwork. Tessa came into our circle the way event planners do, by taking chaos and making it look like grace. She was the woman you called when you needed a gala to shine, or a retirement party to feel like a toast to the next chapter. She had a knack for names and colors and how much light a room needed to flatter a face, and she made fast friends with everyone from my principal to the parent volunteers who couldn't tie a bow to save themselves. I trusted her because she was good to me, because she texted me pictures of floral swatches and asked about Lily's AP exams, and because in our 40s we cling to the friends who show up when the casserole needs delivering and the forms need filing. Mark and I were not flashy, but we looked like it sometimes when Tessa worked her magic on a room. He'd wear the sharp suit, I'd wear the simple dress with the good necklace, and we'd walk into spaces that whispered old money, though none of it was ours. I liked the illusion because it was occasional and earned the way a borrowed coat warms you even after you give it back. We were not the kind of couple that made scenes. Our arguments tended to fold themselves into practical lists, tuition, travel timelines. When he started coming home later, the reasons sounded like the rest of our life traffic clients a dinner he couldn't duck. He'd kiss my cheek, rinse a glass, and ask about Lily's college essays as if the clock on the stove didn't say 11:42. The first tension didn't scream. It ticked. A receipt in his trousers for cocktails at a hotel bar, where the cheapest thing on the menu still stung the place card in Tessa's hand, where a caterer's name usually appeared, the way his voice softened when he said her name, as if it had too many vowels. I told myself they planned events together. Our school had hired Tessa for the scholarship gala, and Mark's company often sponsored tables. It was all so reasonable, so woven into the life we'd built, that to tug at any thread felt like accusing my own past of lying. But then I saw the suit again on a Wednesday, a night with no gala and no donor dinner, and the lilac citrus traced the air like someone else had already been home. I folded the jacket and set it on the chair as if I were setting down something fragile, then stood in the doorway and watched my kitchen do what kitchens do, catch the light, hold the quiet weight. Lily called out to ask if I knew where the stapler went, and I answered on autopilot while my mind turned the place card over and over, reading nothing and hearing everything. Tessa had texted earlier a photo of tall white candles and a caption about elegant restraint, the sort of mood board that usually makes me smile. I stared at my phone until the screen went black. My reflection, looking back with the kind of calm you don't feel until you decide to have it. I told myself that nothing was wrong, that I would sleep, that the morning would sand down whatever edge the evening had sharpened. And then Mark stepped out of the shower, humming a song Tessa had sent me last week for the gala playlist. He reached for the jacket without looking, then paused when he saw my hand resting on the lapel. "That needs dry cleaning," I said, and let my fingers fall away. The dishwasher clicked off. Lily laughed at something in the other room, and my phone lit the counter with a brief square of light. It was a message, her name on the screen, and 5 words that nodded through the perfume and the place card like thread through a button. "Same time tomorrow, Whitmore Lobby." The place card in my husband's pocket never left my mind. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing more than a professional detail, something Tessa scribbled in a hurry, but the perfume lingered like a whisper against my better judgment. I folded laundry with the windows open, the spring air drifting in, and caught myself glancing at the jacket still hanging by the door. It should have been on its way to the dry cleaner, but instead, it sat there like a silent witness, daring me to ask questions I wasn't ready to say aloud. That weekend, Mark reminded me about my father-in-law's upcoming retirement gala. Walter had built a life from the ground up, a contractor who left his mark on half the schools and libraries in our county. The board wanted to honor him for more than the buildings, his quiet generosity, his years of mentoring younger builders, the way he paid apprentices when projects fell through. Mark's company was hosting a table, and Tessa was running the entire evening from floral arrangements to speeches. I tried not to think too hard about how comfortable she seemed with both men in my life, Mark and Walter. She had a gift for slipping into circles, listening just enough flattering without appearing obvious. Every detail about the gala was filtered through her, from the shade of the table linens to the order of the speeches. When she called to ask if I preferred roses or lilies for Walter's table, her voice was bright, professional, and warm. The same voice that had once soothed me when Lily was sick, and I couldn't leave work. The night of the gala. The Whitmore Grand shimmered in candlelight. The lobby smelled faintly of roses, the same scent drifting from the centerpieces she had chosen. Guests filled the ballroom with laughter, shaking Walter's hand, clapping him on the back, toasting his name. I should have felt proud watching him soak in the recognition he had earned, but my gaze kept drifting to the corner where Tessa stood near Mark, pointing at cue cards, adjusting his tie with a familiarity that sank like a stone in my stomach. Mark brushed it off when he caught me watching, smiling the kind of smile he used in boardrooms, polished and practiced. He introduced me to Harold Kim, the chairman of the Education Advancement Fund. Harold spoke warmly of Walter's impact and how the Brooks family name was tied to values of integrity and community. He even mentioned Mark's growing reputation in sales, hinting at future opportunities, and I nodded politely, though my chest tightened. Harold saw a proud family legacy. I saw cracks forming in the foundation. As speeches began, Mark slipped into his role with ease, standing at the podium, his voice carrying steady across the room. He spoke about his father's grit, his devotion to work and family, and the lessons passed down through generations. Applause filled the hall, and I clapped along, though my eyes caught Tessa in the shadows, her expression soft and almost private, as if she were the one meant to receive his words. I told myself I was imagining it, but my hands trembled in my lap until Lily nudged me and whispered that her grandfather looked so happy. After dinner, I excused myself to the powder room, needing space to breathe. Inside, I found 2 women at the mirror, fixing lipstick, whispering in tones they thought no one else could hear. I recognized them from the donor list wives of board members. One of them mentioned Tessa by name, laughing under her breath about how often she was seen on Mark's arm during planning meetings. The other shook her head, saying she was sure it was innocent, but her eyes betrayed doubt. When they noticed me, they smiled quickly, brushing past with perfumed air trailing behind. I stared at my own reflection for a long moment, lipstick untouched, hearing the echo of their voices. I had counseled students through betrayals, taught them how to trust their instincts, how to set boundaries. And yet here I was, smoothing my dress and stepping back into the ballroom, pretending the unease was no more than indigestion. Later that night, Walter took the stage. His voice wavered with emotion as he thanked everyone who had walked beside him, from his wife, who had passed years before, to Mark, who carried on his name to the community that had supported him through decades of hard work. His eyes shone with pride as he looked at us, the family seated at the front. I wanted to believe we looked like the picture he painted, but when I glanced sideways, Mark was already leaning toward Tessa. His head bent too close to hers as she passed him a folded sheet of notes. The applause rose again, glasses clinked, and Walter bowed his head. I clapped until my hands stung, though the sound around me felt hollow. On the drive home, Lily slept in the back seat, her curls pressed against the window while Mark scrolled through his phone in the glow of passing streetlights. I asked how he thought the evening went, and he answered with a distracted nod, mentioning that Tessa had pulled off the impossible once again. He spoke her name with admiration, not the simple courtesy of a colleague, and the perfume I had smelled days before returned in my memory with full force. I lay awake long after the house settled into silence, my thoughts circling back to that folded place card and the women whispering in the powder room. The gala had been a celebration of legacy, a public picture of unity, but I could feel something shifting underneath it all. The night had left Walter honored and proud, but it left me with a question that gnawed deeper than any applause could hide. What exactly was my husband building, and with whom? The gala left me with a restless ache I couldn't shake. In the days that followed, I moved through my routines, like a woman wearing someone else's shoes, functional enough, but always aware of the pinch. At school, I sat with students about scholarships and course plans, listening intently, but the perfume and the whispers in the powder room still pressed against my mind. By the time I came home, the house felt heavy, carrying silence that Mark filled with reports of business dinners and late meetings. His words were steady, but they didn't reach his eyes. One evening, as I stood at the sink rinsing plates, Lily leaned on the counter scrolling her phone. Without looking up, she asked Mom why was Dad talking to Mrs. Grant after everyone left the gala. They seemed close. Her tone was cautious, like she was afraid of crossing a line she didn't fully understand. I dried my hands carefully, smiled at her, and said they probably had last-minute details to settle. She accepted it at face value, but my chest tightened at how easily the lie came. I tried to sleep that night, but the bed felt wider than usual. Mark's breathing was steady beside me, but his body angled away, his phone face down on the nightstand. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, and let the quiet stretch long enough that it felt like its own conversation. The place card, the perfume, the whispers, all of it weighed on me. I rolled to my side, facing him in the dark, and wondered how long I could pretend not to notice. The next morning, I stopped by Margaret Lewis's office before the first bell. She had been my colleague for years, the kind of woman who kept peppermints in a jar and knew how to listen without forcing advice. I closed the door behind me, sat down heavily in the chair across from her, and admitted what I hadn't said to anyone else. I told her about the jacket, the gala, and Lily's question. She didn't gasp or scold. She simply leaned forward, her voice low and even, and asked, "What do you feel when you picture them together?" The question startled me, but the answer rose too easily. Hurt. Not shock, not anger, just hurt deep and bone-tired. Margaret nodded as if she had expected that. Sometimes the hardest part, she said, is realizing your instincts were speaking long before your mind gave them words. I left her office calmer, though no less certain that something was wrong. That weekend, Mark said he was working late another client dinner. I didn't argue. Instead, I waited until Lily was at a friend's house, then sat in the living room with only a lamp lit, staring at the front door. Hours passed, and when it finally opened, Mark stepped in with the faint trace of cologne and the wrinkle of clothes that hadn't seen an office. He smiled too wide and too late and carried himself as though nothing had happened. I didn't ask. I simply said good night and let the silence stand where words would have fallen flat. The next day, I drove to Walter's house to drop off paperwork he needed for insurance. His living room smelled of old wood and coffee the way it always had. He sat in his chair, glasses perched low, flipping through notes about his speech from the gala. He looked proud but tired a man, both relieved and unsettled to be stepping away from work. He asked how Mark was holding up, and I heard myself say busy, though the word tasted bitter. Walter smiled faintly and said, "Busy isn't always good. Sometimes busy is just hiding." I nodded, not trusting myself to answer. That night, I heard Mark in the kitchen whispering into his phone. I couldn't catch the words, just the tone, soft coaxing, a shade of intimacy he hadn't used with me in months. When I stepped into the doorway, he ended the call quickly and smiled with practiced ease. "Just work," he said, sliding his phone into his pocket. His eyes flicked toward me, then away, and the ache in my chest deepened. The days blurred into one another, filled with small fractures I couldn't ignore. A credit card statement with dinners I hadn't attended. A hotel receipt tucked into his briefcase, dismissed as a client needing an off-site meeting. A forgotten text notification flashing across his phone screen before he could swipe it away. Each moment by itself could be explained, but together they formed a pattern I couldn't unsee. I found myself moving slower at home, careful in my own spaces, as though my body already knew it wasn't safe to relax. Even the walls felt different, as if the house had absorbed the lies and now held them in the drywall. At night, I sat with a cup of tea in the quiet, listening to the hum of the dishwasher, wondering if this was the sound of a marriage slipping away. Lily noticed, though she didn't press. She started spending more time in her room, headphones on, eyes cautious, when she came into the kitchen. One evening, she asked if I was okay, and I kissed her cheek and told her school had been busy. She nodded slowly, but her glance toward Mark's empty chair at the table told me she already suspected more. When Margaret asked me later that week if I had confronted him, I shook my head. "Not yet," I said. My voice surprised me. It wasn't angry or frantic, just tired. She touched my hand lightly and said, "You'll know when it's time." That night, as I folded laundry alone, I held one of Mark's shirts and smelled the faint trace of that same lilac citrus perfume. It was no longer a question. The truth was here, lingering in the fabric, waiting for me to name it. I set the shirt down gently, my hands steady, though my heart felt like it had split open. The house was quiet except for the clock ticking on the wall, and I stood there listening, feeling the weight of everything I hadn't yet said. For the first time, I allowed myself to admit it without softening the words. He was betraying me. And once I named it, I knew I could never go back to pretending. Once I admitted the truth to myself, the air in my house changed. Every corner seemed to hold a trace of something I couldn't quite clean away. The shirt with perfume in its fabric, the credit card slips tucked into drawers, the way Mark smiled too easily when his phone buzzed, each detail stacked on the last, until the silence between us grew unbearable. I no longer reached for excuses, and I no longer softened what I knew. It was a Thursday evening when the first crack opened into something wider. I had just set dinner on the table, roasted chicken and vegetables, Lily's favorite. Mark came home later than usual. His tie loosened his shirt untucked, in a way that suggested more than a long day at work. He kissed Lily's hair absent-mindedly, barely glancing at the plate I placed in front of him, then excused himself to take a quick call. His voice drifted in from the hallway, low and warm. Nothing like the clipped tone he used for clients. I stared at my untouched food, waiting for the words to confirm what I already knew. After Lily went upstairs, I followed the faint sound of his voice. He stood by the coat closet, head bent, whispering, as if the walls themselves might betray him. When he noticed me, he ended the call abruptly, sliding the phone into his pocket, as though nothing had happened. "Work," he said, the word too sharp, too quick. I didn't reply. I only held his gaze long enough that he finally turned away, muttering something about needing a shower. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room with only the table lamp glowing, the tick of the clock keeping me company. Around midnight, our neighbor Diane Foster stopped by with a package that had been left at her door by mistake. She stepped inside, her eyes kind but curious, and asked if everything was all right. I don't know what it was in her voice, but I found myself confessing more than I meant to. Diane had lived down the street for years, seen our children grow together, and she listened with the quiet patience of someone who already suspected more than she let on. She hesitated before speaking, then said she'd seen Mark's car parked outside Tessa's townhouse earlier that week. Her words were careful, not cruel, but they landed heavy in my chest. "I didn't want to interfere," she added softly, "but you deserve to know." I thanked her, closing the door gently after she left, my hands shaking as I locked it. It wasn't just perfume or whispers anymore. It was proof carried on the lips of someone who had no reason to lie. The next morning, I packed Lily's lunch and kissed her forehead as she hurried off to school. My body moved through every task on autopilot, packing papers into my bag, locking the door behind me, yet my mind was somewhere else entirely. At work, Margaret noticed my distraction immediately. I closed her office door and repeated Diane's words. Margaret listened, her brow furrowed, and asked me the question I had been avoiding. "What are you going to do with this?" I didn't answer right away. The truth was, I didn't know. All I knew was that the life I had been clinging to was no longer mine. That evening, when Mark came home, I watched him more closely than before. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed his secrets were safe, who believed my silence meant ignorance. I said nothing as he poured himself a drink and settled on the couch. Instead, I sat across from him and studied the lines of his face, the casual way he scrolled his phone, the faint smirk he didn't realize had become permanent. Later, in the stillness of our bedroom, I finally allowed myself to feel the depth of my sorrow. It wasn't the sharp burn of betrayal alone. It was the quiet erosion of years, the realization that every sacrifice I had made for our family meant nothing to him. My tears fell silently, soaking the pillow, and I let them come. The sound of his steady breathing beside me felt foreign, almost cruel in its indifference. The following Sunday, Walter invited us for dinner. Lily was excited to see her grandfather, and I forced myself into a smile for her sake. Walter greeted us warmly, his pride in Mark still evident in the way he introduced him to neighbors who had stopped by. I watched the admiration in his eyes and felt the weight of the secret pressing against my chest. I wanted to protect him from the truth, at least for a little while longer. During dinner, Walter told stories of his early years in construction, of long nights and unpaid invoices, of how he had built his company brick by brick. He looked at Mark as if expecting him to carry the same torch. I saw Mark bask in the attention, nodding at all the right places, even placing his hand over mine for effect, when Walter praised our marriage. The gesture made my stomach twist, but I held my composure. The performance was not for me, it was for everyone else at the table. When we returned home, Lily went straight to her room, leaving Mark and me alone in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, sipping a glass of water, his expression calm, almost smug. "Tonight went well," he said casually, as though nothing weighed between us. I nodded, setting my bag down, but my silence lingered too long. He noticed his eyes narrowing slightly. What he asked, half amused, half wary. I met his gaze and said quietly, "I know." His smirk faltered, but only for a second. "Know what?" he asked. his voice light rehearsed. I didn't elaborate. I only held his eyes until he looked away, retreating upstairs with a muttered excuse. I stayed in the kitchen long after the lights dimmed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. The words had finally left my lips, and though they hadn't been loud, they were enough to shift the ground beneath us. That night, as I lay in bed, the sorrow began to change shape. It was no longer just grief, it was clarity. I couldn't keep pretending, and I couldn't keep carrying his lies on my back. Something inside me had stirred something steady and unyielding. I didn't yet know what steps I would take, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: the silence was over, and once broken, it could never return. The night I finally told Mark, I know I expected an argument, maybe even a confession, but what I got instead was silence that pressed on every wall of the house. He avoided me the next day, moving through his routines with the efficiency of a man trying not to be caught. He spoke about travel schedules, about clients, about Walter's legacy, but his eyes never rested on mine for more than a second. His distance was meant to protect him, yet it gave me space to think with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. I didn't yell or confront him with evidence. Instead, I began taking small, deliberate steps. The first was gathering papers, bank statements, property documents the retirement fund Walter had so carefully built. I opened a safe deposit box at a downtown bank one Mark didn't know about and placed copies of everything inside. My hands shook as I signed the forms, but the moment the box closed with a heavy click, a steadiness came over me. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was preparing. At work, Margaret could sense the shift. Over coffee one morning, she asked if I felt ready for what might come. I told her I wasn't sure what ready meant, but I knew I couldn't stand still anymore. She nodded, her expression calm but firm. "Then move in the way that feels safe," she said. Her words echoed later that night as I opened our filing cabinet and quietly sorted through folders while Mark slept upstairs. Every document I touched felt like a brick I was taking back from a house he had tried to build on lies. I kept my silence in front of Lily, protecting her from the cracks that widened with each day. She noticed the coolness between us, but didn't ask questions, and I was grateful for her restraint. I cooked her favorite meals, asked about her essays, and reminded her of her worth in every way I knew how. Mark's shadow had already dimmed the house enough. I refused to let it reach her more than it had to. One evening, while clearing the dining table, I overheard Mark on the phone in the living room. His voice was sharp, urgent, nothing like the honeyed tones I'd caught before. "It has to be ready by the end of the quarter," he said. "Don't worry about Elena, she trusts me." The words sliced through me, but I stayed in the kitchen, hands steady as I stacked plates. If he thought I still trusted him, that was a mistake I planned to let him keep making. The next step came quietly. Diane stopped by one afternoon with a basket of lemons from her tree. As we sat on my porch sipping tea, she admitted she had seen Mark again, this time with Tessa, at a cafe near the business district. They hadn't noticed her, but their closeness was impossible to mistake. I thanked her for telling me, and though the confirmation stung, it also hardened my resolve. I no longer doubted. I no longer questioned. I knew. I began keeping a journal, writing down dates, places, and details of every inconsistency, every whisper of proof. Not out of spite, but to keep myself from being gaslit into forgetting. Each page was a quiet act of defiance, a record no one could take from me. I stored it in the same box at the bank, the ink still fresh, when I closed the cover. Mark noticed small changes my late afternoons spent running errands, the careful way I avoided questions about finances, but he seemed too distracted to dig. His focus was on appearances, on keeping Walter proud and the community convinced. At dinner with neighbors, he poured wine and spoke warmly of our marriage while I smiled faintly and let him play his part. Inside, I had already begun rehearsing mine. The clearest moment came during a board fundraiser Walter attended. I stood beside him listening as Harold Kim praised the Brooks family for their integrity. I felt Walter's pride radiating like heat, and I realized Mark's betrayal wasn't just mine to bear, it threatened to stain the very name Walter had spent a lifetime building. My heart ached for him, but it also gave me purpose. Protecting Walter's legacy became as important as protecting myself. That night, after Mark fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room, the lamp casting a small circle of light on the rug. I thought about every sacrifice I had made, every trust I had given, every quiet doubt I had swallowed. I thought about Tessa's perfume, Diane's careful words, Margaret's steady advice. I thought about Lily, her future just beginning, and how I couldn't let her grow up believing this was what love looked like. The sorrow was still there, but it no longer drowned me. It had hardened into something sharper, something I could use. I wasn't ready for confrontation yet, but I was ready to act in ways Mark wouldn't see coming. I folded the last of the papers into my bag, switched off the lamp, and let the house settle into silence. As I climbed the stairs, I heard Mark stir, muttering in his sleep. I paused at the doorway, watching him roll onto his back, his face soft in the dim light. For a brief second, I remembered the man I once trusted, the man who had promised forever. Then I turned away, knowing that man no longer existed. The next morning, the house smelled of coffee and toast, but beneath it lingered something else: resolve. My quiet steps had begun, and though Mark had no idea, the ground beneath him was already shifting. The first true break in the illusion came at a dinner I hadn't planned to attend. Mark had invited me along to a work event at a hotel downtown, a room filled with polished tables and men shaking hands over half-formed deals. I almost declined, but something inside urged me to go. I wore a navy dress, simple but deliberate, and sat quietly at his side, while he laughed too loudly with colleagues. It was there I first met Clara Hayes, a junior associate at his firm, young enough to still seem eager, but old enough to know how to hold a room's attention. She leaned too close when she spoke to him, her hand brushing his sleeve as if it had every right to rest there. Her laughter followed him across the table, and though she smiled politely in my direction, her eyes never lingered on me. The sight was confirmation I hadn't asked for, but could no longer deny. Later that evening, while Mark was across the room, Clara passed by my chair, her perfume sweet and sharp. "You must be Elena," she said warmly, her tone carrying a practiced ease. "Mark talks about you all the time." The words should have comforted me, but instead they rang hollow, the kind of line meant to cover rather than reveal. I thanked her politely, letting the moment pass, but inside, something shifted. He wasn't just careless, he was bold enough to parade it in public, believing no one would ever call him out. When we drove home that night, I watched the lights streak across his face as he talked about business prospects, about how Walter's name still opened doors. I nodded at the right moments, but my mind was elsewhere. The evidence was no longer whispers or perfume. It had a name, a face, and a voice that had leaned too close to my husband. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, the house still quiet. I stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over the maples, and I felt a calm I hadn't known before. Pain had dulled into something steadier, sharper, and with it came clarity. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't trapped. Mark believed his secrets kept him strong, but in truth, they had left him exposed. I began with small acts that looked ordinary. I spoke with Walter about his accounts under the pretense of helping him organize paperwork. I asked gentle questions about his retirement fund, his will, his trust for Lily. He trusted me, and he shared freely, grateful for the help. I listened carefully, storing every detail away, noting every place Mark's name appeared where it did not belong. At work, I leaned on Margaret more often. In her office behind the safety of closed doors, I admitted my plan was no longer just to endure, it was to prepare. She didn't ask for specifics, only reminded me to protect myself first. Her words became a quiet refrain in my mind as I moved through each day, teaching, guiding, smiling, while beneath the surface, I gathered strength. Mark grew bolder in his absences. He came home later, explanations rehearsed but less convincing. He poured money into dinners and gifts expenses marked as client relations on our joint account. I no longer asked questions. Instead, I documented, copied, and filed every receipt I found. He thought my silence meant defeat, but it was strategy. One evening, Lily sat at the table finishing homework while I chopped vegetables for dinner. She glanced up suddenly and asked Mom, "Do you and Dad still love each other?" The question nearly cut through me more sharply than the knife in my hand. I set it down, moved to her side, and brushed her hair back from her forehead. "I love you," I said softly, "more than anything in the world." She nodded, her eyes glistening, and returned to her book. I knew she understood more than she said aloud. That night, as Mark slept, I sat in the quiet glow of the lamp and opened my journal. I wrote down Clara's name, the date, the setting, every detail I could recall from the dinner. Then I turned the page and began a list: assets, accounts, property, debts. Each entry steadied me, turning my pain into something I could hold, something I could use. Diane stopped by a few days later with muffins from her kitchen. As we sat together, she told me she had seen Mark's car again near Tessa's townhouse late in the evening. Her tone was careful, but her eyes carried sorrow. I thanked her, pressing her hand before she left. I no longer needed the confirmation, but every reminder pushed me further from doubt and closer to resolve. By the end of that week, I had gathered enough to see the shape of what Mark had built. His secrets weren't just affairs. They were entanglements, financial and personal, woven tightly with people who thought they held power. But power shifts when truth surfaces, and I was no longer afraid to name it. One Saturday morning, I walked past our bedroom and found his phone on the nightstand, unlocked a message thread open with Clara's name. Words of affection scrolled across the screen, promises laced with arrogance. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I turned, walked downstairs, and let the kettle boil until the whistle filled the kitchen. The sound was sharp, steady, almost like the voice inside me saying, "It's time." The sorrow that had once pinned me down had transformed into certainty. The ground beneath Mark was cracking, though he didn't yet feel it. He believed he held every card, but he had forgotten the most important truth I had been watching all along. And soon the silence I had chosen would end, not with tears, but with the kind of exposure no one could ignore. The evening everything shifted began in the ballroom of the Whitmore Grand, the same place where Walter's retirement had been celebrated months earlier. This time, the lights were brighter, the crowd larger, and the stakes much higher. Harold Kim was hosting a fundraiser for the Education Advancement Fund, and nearly every influential figure in town filled the tables. Mark was in his element, shaking hands, smiling, weaving his father's name into every introduction. I watched him glide across the room, carrying himself as if the Brooks legacy belonged solely to him. I had prepared carefully. My dress was understated, my demeanor calm, but tucked into my bag were copies of statements and receipts, proof of the secrets he thought I had ignored. I had not come to cause a scene, but I had come ready. Tessa was there too, moving between tables with her usual elegance, her hand brushing Mark's arm whenever she passed. Clara sat near the front with several of Mark's colleagues, her eyes following him in a way that was no longer professional. Their alliances were written in gestures visible to anyone who cared to notice. The evening began smoothly with Harold welcoming the guests and praising Walter for his years of service. Walter smiled proudly from his seat, unaware of the storm about to break. When Mark stepped up to the podium, his voice carried easily practiced and steady. He spoke of integrity, of family, of the values passed down through generations. I sat still, my gaze fixed on him, and wondered how many in the room would believe his words if they knew the truth. As applause rippled across the hall, I rose slowly. My movements were deliberate, not hurried, not desperate. I walked toward Harold, who stood near the side of the stage, and quietly handed him a folder. "You should see this," I said softly. His brow furrowed as he glanced at the contents: expense reports misfiled as company dinners, withdrawals from Walter's fund without authorization, and the list of accounts that connected back to Mark. His eyes lifted to mine, shocked but steady, and then to the man still speaking of honor from the podium. The room shifted in an instant. Harold whispered to another board member, papers exchanged hands, and murmurs spread quietly from table to table. Mark continued his speech unaware, but the audience was no longer looking at him with admiration. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others exchanged glances, and a few pulled out phones, already searching for more. The applause that followed his final line was thin, scattered, nothing like the warmth he had expected. When he stepped down, Harold intercepted him with a firm hand on his arm. Their voices carried farther than Mark realized. "We need to talk about these numbers," Harold said. His tone clipped. Mark stammered, trying to laugh it off, but Harold's expression remained hard. "Not here," Mark muttered, pulling away, but the damage had been done. The whispers had grown into a low hum that filled every corner of the ballroom. Tessa appeared at his side, her hand tightening around his sleeve, but even she couldn't quiet the murmurs. Clara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes darting to the exits as though she wanted no part of the unraveling. Walter sat stunned. His fork paused halfway to his plate, confusion clouding his face. My heart ached for him, but I knew the truth was necessary. He deserved to see clearly what his son had become. Mark approached me, then his face taut with anger, barely contained. "What did you do?" he hissed under his breath. I met his gaze calmly, my voice steady. I told the truth. His jaw tightened, his hand twitching as if he wanted to grab my arm, but he stopped, aware of the eyes already watching us. The evening collapsed quickly after that. Harold addressed the room briefly, promising a full review of financials and offering his gratitude for the community's patience. It was a statement meant to calm, but it only confirmed suspicion. Guests began to leave in clusters, some shaking their heads, others whispering openly now. The polished image Mark had built so carefully had cracked wide open, and everyone had seen through it. At home that night, the silence was heavier than ever. Mark stormed through the rooms, muttering about betrayal, about how I had destroyed everything. "You've ruined me!" he spat, his face flushed. I stood in the doorway, my arms folded, and answered evenly. "No, Mark, you did that yourself." His rage faltered at my calm, and for the first time I saw fear in his eyes. Walter called the next morning. His voice was quiet, tired, as he asked if what he had heard was true. I didn't want to wound him, but I couldn't lie. I explained what I had found: the documents the money shifted without his knowledge. There was a long pause, and then he said, "I gave him everything I had, and he still wanted more." His words broke something in me, but also bound me to him in truth. He knew now, and he would never look at his son, the same way again. In the days that followed, the fallout spread quickly. Mark's colleagues distanced themselves. Clara resigned quietly from the firm, and Tessa disappeared from public events. Neighbors' whispered friends turned cold, and the Brooks name, once spoken with pride, now carried scandal. Mark tried to fight, tried to spin stories of sabotage, but every attempt only made him look smaller, weaker. Through it all, I moved quietly, tending to Lily, sitting with Walter, making sure the damage didn't touch the people who didn't deserve it. My dignity remained intact because I had not shouted, had not raged. I had simply let the truth do what lies never could stand on its own. And yet, even as Mark's world collapsed, I knew the final step was still ahead. His fall was nearly complete, but my own closure had not yet come. I could see it on the horizon, steady and certain, waiting for me to take it. The days after the fundraiser carried a strange quiet. Mark's voice, once so certain and loud, was reduced to hurried calls behind closed doors, each one shorter than the last. His colleagues stepped back, sponsors withdrew, and even Tessa stopped appearing at his side. The man who had stood at the podium declaring honor and legacy now moved through our home like a shadow pacing rooms that no longer belonged to him. Walter visited a week later. He looked older than I had ever seen him, the pride that usually lifted his shoulders, weighed down by disappointment. He sat at our kitchen table, hands folded, and told Mark he had reviewed the records himself. "You had everything you needed," he said quietly, and still it wasn't enough. Mark tried to protest, but Walter raised his hand, ending the conversation with a look that spoke of both heartbreak and finality. For Walter, the greatest loss was not money, but trust, and there was no rebuilding what his son had broken. Lily stayed close to me through it all. She didn't ask for details, but she noticed the changes, the way neighbors looked away at the grocery store, the silence at the dinner table, the stack of unopened mail. One evening, she leaned against me on the couch and whispered, "I'm glad you didn't stay quiet." Her words held more weight than she knew. For months, I had kept still, thinking silence was strength, but it was in speaking and acting that I finally protected us both. By the end of the month, Mark packed a bag. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final plea. He left quietly, the sound of the door closing behind him softer than I expected. Tessa followed her own path into obscurity, her business losing clients as whispers spread. Clara resigned and moved on, eager to escape the fallout. The empire of illusions collapsed, leaving only what had always been true. Deceit cannot hold when truth is brought to light. My own life became gentler in his absence. Mornings started with coffee on the porch. Evenings with Lily's laughter drifting from her room. I spent more time with Walter, helping him organize his affairs, making sure his legacy was protected from further harm. He would shake his head sometimes, sorrow in his eyes, but then he would look at me and say, "You did right by this family." Those words steadied me more than he could know. What I carried forward wasn't anger, though it would have been easy to hold on to it. It was clarity. I had learned that love without respect corrodes quietly until it leaves nothing behind, and that protecting your dignity is not selfish, it is necessary. I had learned that betrayal doesn't only test your heart, it tests your voice, asking if you will name what you see or allow someone else's lies to shape your life. I no longer wonder if I could have stopped Mark's choices. They were his to make, and he chose recklessly. What I could control was how long I allowed his choices to define me. And when I finally stood still, steady, and said enough, I discovered that strength doesn't always roar, it sometimes whispers. Now, when I think back to the scent of perfume on his jacket, the whispers in the powder room, the weight of doubt pressing against my chest, I see them differently. They were not signs of my weakness. They were the beginning of my awakening. The life I live now is quieter, smaller in some ways, but it is mine, and it is honest. That is a wealth greater than anything Mark ever pretended to have. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.